When I picked up her lipstick, I recognized it immediately. And the second I turned it over in my hand, I felt something tighten in my chest. A mother knows when something is wrong, even if the world tells her she's imagining it. And that lipstick, that shade, it was wrong. It wasn't wrong because of the color. No, the red was beautiful, the kind of color that makes heads turn when a woman walks into a room. I had chosen it myself. I had placed it in her palm with a smile, thinking I was giving her a gift of confidence, of love, of encouragement to face the world as boldly as she wanted. I thought it was mine to give, mine to see on her lips when she laughed, when she smiled. But when I saw it again, not in her room, not in her purse, but in a place where it had no business being, I knew. My stomach turned. My fingers shook, because that lipstick was not just hers anymore. I remember staring at it for what felt like hours, the way the gold tube caught the faint light in that room. A room I thought was mine. A room I thought belonged to me and me alone. That was where I found it, lying casually on the table, as if it had every right to be there. But it didn't. It never should have been there. My first thought was that I was mistaken, that it belonged to someone else. But no, I knew every scratch on that tube, every tiny dent where it had slipped once from her hands to the floor. I bought it. I had given it. I had watched her use it. And now here it was in the house of a man I thought was mine. I froze. My throat went dry. The room around me blurred because my eyes refused to leave that one small object. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. I wanted to believe coincidence still existed in this world. But deep inside, the truth hissed at me. My daughter has been here, not as a child visiting politely, not as a daughter respecting boundaries. She had been here in the way only a woman enters a man's home. That was when the air left my lungs. That was when my heart broke in a way I never thought possible. People talk about betrayal, but they never tell you how heavy it feels when it's not just a friend, not just a stranger, but your own blood. The lipstick lay there between us, though neither of them were present at that moment. It mocked me. It laughed without sound, daring me to pick it up, daring me to admit what I already knew. I did pick it up. My fingers curled around it with a grip so tight my knuckles whitened. I could feel the faint warmth of her touch still clinging to it. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage, not yet. It wasn't sorrow, though that would come later in waves that nearly drowned me. No, it was clarity. Cold, sharp clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't ask questions, doesn't beg for explanations. The kind that tells you, without a single word, that you have been replaced. I slipped it into my pocket that night, and no one saw. Not him. Not her. They would never know that I had discovered their secret. Not yet. I walked out of that room quietly, my face calm, my steps measured, but inside I was unraveling. Do you know what it is to carry a truth too heavy for your tongue? To sit across from someone you love and pretend you do not see the shadows on their skin? To watch them eat, to hear them laugh, while all you can picture is the lipstick you bought lying in the wrong man's house. That was my torment. That was my reality. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her until the truth spilled from her lips. I wanted to demand answers from him, to claw at the walls of that house until the foundations cracked. But I did none of that, because what would be the point? The evidence was already in my hands. Their secret was already burned into my eyes. So I stayed quiet. I let them think I was blind. I let them laugh. I let them plan. I let them believe I was nothing more than a foolish old woman too tired to notice the games being played around her. But in my silence, I began to plan. I told myself I would not shout. I told myself I would not cry. Instead, I would wait. And when the time was right, I would remind her that every gift carries weight, that every betrayal leaves scars. I would make her wear her shame the way she wore that red, bold, unavoidable, permanent. They thought I would never find out. They thought their little secret was safe. But the lipstick told me everything. And what I did next, they will never forget. That lipstick, that little tube of red, carried far more weight than most would understand. For me, it was a way of saying something words never seemed enough for. It was a bridge between generations, between the woman I had once been and the woman my daughter was becoming. I remember the exact day I decided to buy it. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that hang low and make the world feel smaller. I had been out running errands, carrying the weight of small household needs in my bag, when I passed by the cosmetic shop. Normally, I would never step inside. It wasn't my world anymore. Bright posters of young models with glossy smiles, music humming through hidden speakers, the scent of synthetic flowers and powders pressing down on you the second you entered. I had passed that shop hundreds of times, and each time I walked on without a second glance. But that day, something made me stop. In the window, among the displays of perfumes and lotions, there was a row of lipsticks standing like soldiers in a neat line. Their caps gleamed under the light, and the shades ranged from soft beige to deep plum. But it was the red, bold, rich, impossible to ignore that caught my eye. It seemed to glow differently from the rest. Not flashy, not vulgar, just undeniable. My mind went instantly to her. My daughter. I pictured her face, the way her lips curved when she smiled, the way she sometimes bit the corner of her mouth when she was nervous. I thought of how often she kept herself quiet, as though holding something back, as though afraid to claim the space she deserved. And I thought, maybe this red could give her something. Not just color, but presence. The kind of presence that tells the world, I am here. Look at me. Do not ignore me. So I stepped into the shop. I felt out of place, like a ghost wandering into a room that wasn't meant for her. The young women behind the counters were polished, hair sleek, their faces perfectly painted. One of them came forward, smiling politely, asking if I needed help. I almost left then. I almost turned on my heel and told myself this was ridiculous. But then I gestured to the lipstick, the red one, and asked to see it. She placed it in my hand, and for a moment, I just stared at it. It was small, no bigger than a finger, yet it felt heavy. Heavy with meaning, with the possibility of what it could symbolize. I uncapped it, twisted the base, and watched as the red rose up, smooth and untouched. The girl behind the counter told me it was one of their best sellers. She said many young women bought it when they wanted to feel confident. Her voice was casual, but those words struck me. When they wanted to feel confident, I thought of my daughter again, her hesitations, her insecurities hidden beneath laughter. I thought of the way she sometimes lowered her gaze, even when she had no reason to. And I decided then, this was not just lipstick. This was a gift of courage, a gift of power, a gift from me to her. When I placed it in her hand later that evening, I saw her face light up in a way I will never forget. She blinked at me, almost in disbelief, then smiled. "Mom," she said softly, "you didn't have to." Her fingers cradled the tube delicately, as though it might break. I told her I wanted to. I told her that beauty was not just about appearance, but about how one carried oneself, and that sometimes a woman needed a reminder to hold her head high. She looked at me then with eyes that seemed to soften, to warm. And in that moment, I believed I had done something good. I believed I had given her a piece of myself, wrapped in red and gold. The first time she wore it, I sat in silence and watched her. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that slides gently across the room, painting everything with gold. She leaned close to the mirror, her hand steady, her face calm. I could hear the faint twist of the tube, the quiet click as she uncapped it. Then I saw it, the red blooming across her lips. It was as though the room changed, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to watch. My daughter had always been beautiful, yes, but this was different. This was a transformation. Her lips glistened, bold, confident, commanding. She was no longer just a young woman in her mother's house. She looked like someone who could walk into the world and bend it slightly in her favor. She caught me staring and laughed. "Mama, why are you looking at me like that?" Her voice was teasing, but her eyes searched mine. "Because you're glowing," I told her. "It suits you perfectly." She smiled then, a smile that seemed brighter, sharper. She turned her head from side to side, admiring herself in the mirror. For the first time, I saw her carry herself differently, her shoulders straighter, her chin lifted, her eyes filled with something more than happiness. It was pride, ownership, power. That evening, she walked around the house like she owned every corner of it. She hummed softly, her steps light, her movements deliberate. She even paused by the window, catching her reflection in the glass, smiling at herself as though the world beyond was hers for the taking. I told myself it was good, that this was what I had wanted, for her to feel strong, confident, radiant. But beneath my admiration, a small unease began to grow, because it wasn't just joy on her face. It was something else, something harder. Her smile wasn't only happiness, it was knowing. Her eyes weren't only bright, they were calculating. And though I didn't realize it then, what I saw that evening was the beginning of something I would later wish I had never awakened. Her glow was beautiful, yes, but it was also dangerous. And soon, that red would no longer be a gift. It would be a warning. If you asked me to describe my relationship with my daughter, I would tell you it was both simple and complicated. A thread made of silk and iron all at once. To anyone looking in from the outside, we seemed as close as a mother and daughter could be. People would say things like, "The two of you are inseparable," or "She's your shadow, isn't she?" And I would smile, nod, and feel pride swell in me. Because yes, in so many ways, she was my companion, my joy, the one who gave meaning to my days. We shared laughter easily. The smallest thing, a funny story, a misheard phrase could send us both into fits of giggles that left tears on our cheeks. We had rituals only the two of us understood. Sunday evenings we would sit in the kitchen, she with her tea, me with mine, and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes she told me about her friends, sometimes about dreams she held close, sometimes about the disappointment she tried to hide from others, but never from me. She would curl up on the couch, her legs tucked under her, and talk until her voice grew soft with sleep. In those moments, I felt that our bond was unshakable. But bonds are strange things. They can stretch further than you think, hold stronger than you ever imagined, and yet, under the weight of certain truths, they can snap in an instant. There were differences between us, of course cracks that I noticed, but dismissed as harmless. I was a woman of another time, raised to value loyalty above convenience, to believe that promises were sacred, and that respect for family was the measure of a person's worth. My daughter, though she loved me, belonged to a world where these things seemed less permanent. She spoke casually of relationships, as though they could be tried on and cast aside like clothes that no longer fit. When I spoke of the weight of commitment, she would smile at me with that look young people give the old affectionate, but dismissive, as if my words were relics from a museum. "Mom," she once said, "you worry too much. Times have changed. People don't live like that anymore." I laughed with her, but inside, her words unsettled me. Because while she saw change as freedom, I saw it as fragility. And fragility always breaks. Yet I was proud of her. Always proud. She was clever, quick-witted, and beautiful in a way that seemed to glow from her skin. I watched her walk into rooms and saw heads turn. I heard her speak and people listened. She carried herself with a kind of effortless grace I never had. And when she wore the lipstick I had given her, that red I chose so carefully, it was as though she carried not just her beauty, but mine too, my pride, my hope, my legacy. Still, there were moments when her laughter carried an edge, when her eyes flashed with something sharp I didn't understand. Moments when she seemed distant even while sitting right beside me, as though her body was present, but her spirit already belonged somewhere else. That was our relationship. Love tangled with distance, closeness shadowed by small misunderstandings, a bond that I thought could never break, but one that was already beginning to fray without me knowing. And through it all, the lipstick sat silently between us, a symbol of my gift, her glow, and the cracks that would soon widen into something I could never repair. It began the way all changes do, quietly. At first, there was nothing I could point to, nothing that would make anyone else stop and say, something is wrong. But mothers notice. We notice the pauses in a child's voice, the way their footsteps change when they enter the house, the glances that linger a second too long, or the smiles that come too quickly. She began staying out later than before. At first, she explained it easily. Work, friends, errands, harmless things. I believed her because why wouldn't I? She was young. her life full of possibilities, and I didn't want to be the kind of mother who chained her daughter to the house with suspicion. So I smiled and nodded, telling her to be careful, telling her not to tire herself out. But a seed of unease planted itself quietly in my heart. Soon, I noticed her phone never left her hand. Even when she sat with me, her fingers danced across the screen, her eyes lit by a glow that had nothing to do with me. She laughed sometimes at messages I couldn't see, laughed softly to herself as though sharing secrets with a ghost I could never meet. When I asked her about it, she waved me off, her smile a little too sharp, her voice a little too quick. "It's nothing, Mama," she would say. "Don't worry." But her eyes avoided mine. And then there were the smells. A faint trace of perfume on her clothes, not hers, not mine. A scent that lingered in the air when she passed, subtle but undeniable. It was not the fragrance of youth trying new products from a shop. It was something heavier, intimate, something that clung to her skin like memory. The lipstick, too, began to tell its own story. Some mornings, I would find it smudged unevenly. The red spread across her lips in a way that spoke of hurried application, as if done in a mirror not our own. Other times, I noticed the faint outline of her lips left on cups she had not used at home. It was the kind of detail that screams loudly to a mother, even if no one else hears it. I told myself she was just living her life, that she was experimenting with her youth, that none of it meant anything. I tried to silence the voice inside me that whispered something was changing, something was slipping away. But mothers know. We always know, even when we tell ourselves we don't. What struck me most was her glow. Not the glow of the lipstick this time, but the glow of someone holding secrets. She hummed under her breath when she thought I couldn't hear, her steps lighter than usual, her face carrying a smile that never seemed to include me. She looked at her reflection in the window as if it were a lover's gaze, as if she was sharing a silent conversation with someone who wasn't there. And when she left the house, she left with urgency, her movements quick, her anticipation barely concealed. I would watch her disappear down the street, her shoulders lifted, her pace brisk, and my heart would twist. I wanted to call her back, to hold her close, to demand the truth. But I stayed silent, because silence felt safer than answers I wasn't ready to face. The nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of her footsteps. When they finally came, they were softer than they should have been, careful, almost guilty. She would slip into her room without a word, and I would pretend to be asleep. But my chest would ache, because I knew she was carrying something she didn't want me to see. Something I feared I already understood, but dared not name. So I told myself what mothers always tell themselves when they are afraid. That it was nothing. That she was fine. That I was imagining it. But deep down I knew. The lipstick I had given her as a gift of love was no longer just mine to give. It had become part of a secret that would soon come crashing into my world. And when it did, it would tear everything apart. There is something I must admit, though it is not easy for a mother to say aloud. In the years after my husband was gone, the house felt emptier than I could bear. The laughter had faded, the conversations ended, and I found myself listening to silence that stretched too long, like a cloth pulled too thin. My daughter was growing, stepping into her own world, and though I loved her with every piece of me, love does not erase loneliness. That was when he entered my life, not in some dramatic fashion, not with thunder or fireworks, but quietly, like a shadow slipping into a room unnoticed. He was not the kind of man whose face would appear on billboards or whose name would be spoken in gossip with awe. He lived simply, he worked steadily, he carried himself without boast. Yet there was something about him that drew me in. He spoke in a way that made you lean forward, not louder than others, but more certain. He listened in a way that made you feel the weight of your words mattered, as if your thoughts had found a safe place to rest. I remember the first time his hand brushed against mine, not in a clumsy accident, but in a moment so natural it felt as though it had always been meant to happen. His skin was rough, marked with the years of labor he had known, but beneath the calluses there was gentleness. That contrast struck me deeply. For so long I had been strong for everyone else, bearing burdens silently. To feel a hand that was both strong and gentle against mine reminded me that I was still a woman, not just a mother, not just a widow. It was not a love I shouted about. It was not a relationship of grand displays or public declarations. In fact, it was hidden carefully, deliberately, not out of shame, but out of protection. People have sharp tongues. They carve stories out of half-seen gestures, and I had no desire to give them knives to wield against me. So he became my secret, my treasure, my relief in the long hours when the walls of my house closed in too tightly. He never asked me to give him everything. He never demanded proof or ownership. He simply gave me presence. When I was with him, I felt wanted not for what I could provide, not for the title of mother or caretaker, but simply for myself, for the lines etched on my face, for the laughter that sometimes escaped me, for the stories I told. He listened. He remembered. He made me feel that my voice still mattered in a world that often overlooks women who have carried too much for too long. And so I kept him close, though no one else knew. Not my family, not my friends, not even my daughter, especially not my daughter, for she would never understand, and I did not want to explain. He was mine, mine alone. I lived in the daylight as the dutiful woman everyone thought I was, but when the evenings came, when I stepped into his presence, I felt something different, freedom. A kind of quiet joy that reminded me life was not yet finished with me. It was this secrecy that made him a man in the shadows, not because he was less real, but because he was more precious that way. Every love, whether whispered or shouted, claims a space. For us, that space was his house. From the outside, it was ordinary, the kind of building people walk past without a second thought. The paint was faded in places, the steps creaked when you climbed them, and the garden was more wild than trimmed. To neighbors it was nothing remarkable. But to me, it was a place where I was not defined by duty, where I could exist without the weight of titles pressed against my shoulders. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood and earth, a grounding scent that reminded me of simpler times. The floors carried the marks of years, but they felt solid beneath my feet. The walls were plain, unadorned, yet I found comfort in their bareness as if they had nothing to hide. But it was one room in particular that captured me, and even now I can close my eyes and step back into it. It was not large, nor decorated with grandeur. There were no expensive paintings, no polished furniture meant to impress. Instead, it was humble, almost plain, and that was what made it mine. There was a chair in the corner, worn smooth from years of use, and it became my chair. Whenever I sat in it, I felt as though the world outside ceased to exist. By the window was a small table, just large enough for a book, a scarf, or a cup of tea, and often I left little things behind. A folded cloth, a half-finished note, a flower picked on the way. He never moved them. He never questioned why they were there. And because of that, they remained waiting for me each time I returned, a quiet sign that I expected, that my presence mattered. The window was my favorite. It let in a soft light in the mornings, the kind that made dust float like tiny stars in the air. I would sit in my chair and watch the light shift across the room, feeling a peace I could not find anywhere else. I would close my eyes and imagine the world pausing for just that moment, holding still so I could breathe without weight pressing down on me. That room was the only place where I felt truly mine. At home, I was a mother, a caretaker, a woman defined by her duties. Outside, I was a face in the crowd, another body moving through the noise of life. But in that room, I was simply myself. I could laugh if I wanted, cry if I needed to, sit in silence without explanation. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that the room knew me, that it carried my presence in its walls, that it remembered me in the quiet hours when I was away. I never once imagined that another woman could enter it with the same ease, leaving her trace as though it belonged to her too. I never thought that the space I held so close would be shared behind my back. But at the time, I felt only peace. Each visit strengthened the illusion that I had something no one else could touch. The room was steady, unchanging, faithful to me. It was the lifeline I clung to in a world that moved too quickly, a world that often left me behind. If I had known then what was waiting for me, the object I would one day find lying in plain sight on that table, mocking me with its silence, perhaps I would have stayed away. Perhaps I would have protected myself from the wound that was coming. But we never see betrayal until it is too late. And I was blind then, blind because love, even secret love, makes fools of us all. There are objects in life we treat as ordinary until the moment they reveal their power to wound us. A pair of shoes, a shirt, a photograph, a tube of lipstick. And that day it was lipstick. I had gone to the room as I always did, my footsteps steady, my heart ready to unclasp itself from the weight of the outside world. It was supposed to be my place of safety, my one room, my chair, my window, the small table that waited faithfully. But the piece I carried into that room died the moment my eyes caught the glint of gold in the light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the sun. Dust dancing, metal catching the edge of a beam. I blinked, looked again. No, it was real. A small cylinder of gold and red sitting boldly on the table, careless, almost arrogant in the way it lay there. My steps slowed. My chest grew tight. Even from across the room, I recognized it. The color of the cap, the faint scratch along the side where she had once dropped it, the tiny smudge of her fingerprint still faintly visible. It was hers, my daughter's. I froze. The air around me changed. The room that had always embraced me now felt like it was holding its breath. My hand shook as I reached forward, every muscle resisting and yet compelled. When my fingers finally closed around it, the weight of it nearly buckled me. I twisted it open, slowly, as though confirming what I already knew. The red rose up, rich and defiant, the same red I had seen glowing on her lips. I remembered the day I had bought it for her, how carefully I had chosen it, how I had told myself it would make her feel beautiful, powerful, cherished. That memory clashed violently with the sight of it now, lying in the one room I believed no one else would ever claim. My breath came shallow. My mind raced. Perhaps she had lost it and it had found its way here by chance. Perhaps he had found it elsewhere and simply brought it in. Perhaps the world was not as cruel as the picture forming in my head. I repeated these excuses, desperate, clinging to them as though they could protect me. But beneath the noise of denial, a quieter voice whispered, steady, cold, she was here. She has been here. In this room. In his room. In my room. I sat heavily in the chair by the window, the lipstick clutched in my hand. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The walls seemed to lean closer, pressing against me, listening, waiting. My eyes blurred with tears that burned but refused to fall. I stared at the object until it became a blur of red and gold. That lipstick, once a gift of love, had transformed into evidence. Evidence of intrusion, of betrayal, of a boundary crossed I had never thought possible. I placed it back on the table slowly, almost reverently, as though it were a sacred thing, though it mocked me with its presence. It looked so harmless lying there, so ordinary, but I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that it had destroyed something inside me. At that moment, I became two people. The woman who had walked into that room believing it was hers alone, and the woman who now knew she was not alone in it at all. I left the house quietly that day, but the silence I carried was not peace. It was heavy, jagged, the silence of something broken. I told no one, not him, not her. To the world, I was unchanged. I smiled, I cooked, I moved through my days. But inside, a crack had formed in my heart, and with each beat, it spread wider. At home, I studied her more closely. My daughter, the one I had given that lipstick to with hands trembling with pride. I watched her wear it now, her lips painted with the very shade I had chosen. Each time she smiled, I felt my chest tighten. Each laugh, each careless flick of her hair, each secretive glance to her phone, all of it felt different now. I searched her face for clues, for confessions unspoken. Did she know what she had done? Did she understand where she had been? What room she had invaded? Or did she believe her secret was safe, her trail invisible? I became a watcher in my own home. When she came in late at night, I listened to the careful way her footsteps crept across the floor. When she spoke to me, her eyes sometimes darted away too quickly, her words too light, too practiced. And always, always, her lips gleamed red, like a signature I could not erase. I remembered the way she had looked the first time I gave her that lipstick, the delight in her eyes, the way she had held it like treasure. My heart had swelled with pride then, but now, when I replayed that memory, pride was replaced with a hollow ache. That gift had not been a bond, it had been a weapon, and unknowingly, I had placed it in her hand. I wanted to ask her. I wanted to shake her, demand answers, demand truth. But each time the words rose to my lips, I swallowed them down. Silence, I told myself, was safer. Silence gave me time to think, to gather, to plan. But silence also hurts. It ate at me, gnawed at me, left me restless in the night. And yet, beneath the pain, something else began to stir, resolve. A quiet awareness that this story could not end with silence. That sooner or later, the truth would have to be faced, spoken, lived. I looked at her sometimes and saw the little girl she once was, running into my arms, pressing her small face against me, trusting me with her whole heart. And then I looked at the woman she had become, her lips painted red, and I wondered when the gap between those two versions had grown so wide I could no longer cross it. The lipstick sat in my memory like a flame that would not go out. Every time I thought of that room, I saw it there, waiting, daring me to pretend it wasn't real. And with each thought, the crack in my heart widened. At that moment, I knew, though I could not yet say the words, that my daughter and I were bound together by something neither of us could escape. Something I could not yet name, but I would. And when I did, it would change everything. When I first saw that lipstick lying on the table in that room, I told myself it was nothing. A coincidence, a misunderstanding. The mind plays tricks on us when it is afraid of the truth, and mine worked harder than ever to shield me. I built entire stories to explain it away. Perhaps it was not hers at all, just another shade that looked the same. Perhaps he had picked it up somewhere in a shop, in a friend's house, and forgotten to mention it. Perhaps fate itself was mocking me with illusions. I repeated these things over and over, desperate to quiet the voice inside me that said otherwise. But denial is like stitching up a wound without cleaning. It may look closed, but infection festers underneath. At night, when I lay on my bed, I saw it again and again. That small tube, catching the light, daring me to ignore its truth. I tried to pray it away, tried to bury myself in housework, tried to distract myself with noise. But the silence always came back, and with it, the image of red against gold. I told myself I was foolish, that I was seeing shadows where none existed. But the crack in my heart was already there, and each time I thought of that room, the crack widened just a little more. When the present becomes too heavy, the mind drifts into memory. I found myself remembering him, the man I had trusted with pieces of myself I had not given to anyone else. I remembered the first time he looked at me as though I mattered, as though I was not invisible in a world that often ignores women of my age. I remembered the first time he held my hand, how the roughness of his skin met the softness of mine, and how that touch reminded me that I was still alive. That room became a living memory in itself. The worn chair, the table, the way sunlight crept across the floor in slow lines, each detail etched into me. I had left pieces of myself there. A book with the corner folded, a scarf draped over the arm of the chair, a cup I always used. He had left them undisturbed, as though acknowledging that those small objects marked my presence, my claim. But after the lipstick, those memories became poisoned. Each time I remembered his eyes on me, I wondered if they had also rested on her. Each time I remembered laughter, I wondered if she had laughed there too. Each time I recalled placing my scarf on that chair, I imagined her perfume woven into its fabric. Memory, once my refuge, became a mirror that showed me betrayal. I could not stop looking, yet every glance tore me open again. At home, life continued, at least on the surface, but nothing looked the same to me. I began to watch her more closely, quietly and carefully. Her lips, painted red, always that same red. I watched her lean into the mirror, steadying her hand as she traced color onto her mouth. I remembered giving it to her, the way her eyes had lit up, the way I had felt pride. Now, watching her press her lips together, sealing that color, I felt something else entirely: dread. There were scents, faint but cruel reminders. Sometimes when she walked past, I caught the smell of the very air that lingered in that room. I knew it too well to mistake it. It clung to her clothes as it once clung to mine. And her stories, careless, small remarks that should have meant nothing, but struck me like blades. She mentioned a window once, and I knew which window it was. She spoke of a chair, worn but comfortable, and I knew which chair she meant. She laughed about how a scarf had been left draped in a corner, and my heart sank because it was mine. My scarf, my place. The glow in her face unsettled me most of all. She carried brightness, the shine of someone who was being seen, cherished, wanted. It was the same light I had once carried after leaving that room, when my steps felt lighter and my heart steadier. Now that light was hers, and I was left with heaviness. I told myself not to accuse without proof, not to let suspicion drive me into madness. But I knew. With each look, with each scent, with each story I knew. I watched her, and in my silence, the crack inside me widened. She did not notice, or perhaps she thought my silence was ignorance. But I saw her. I saw the red on her lips, and I knew where it had been. In those weeks, suspicion seeped into everything I did. When I cooked, I found myself staring at the knife in my hand longer than necessary, my thoughts wandering places they should not go. When I swept the floor, I thought of the footsteps she must have left in that room, layered over mine. When I washed dishes, the clatter of plates reminded me of the silence in his house, and how silence could no longer comfort me. People outside noticed nothing. To neighbors, I was the same woman I had always been: polite, quiet, dependable. They greeted me in the market, asked about my daughter, and spoke casually of weddings and futures. They did not know that every mention of her name made my chest ache. I thought of the sacrifices I had made to raise her, the nights I had gone without so she could have more. I thought of how I had poured myself into her life, into her future. And now, it felt as though she had taken from me the one thing I had kept for myself. There is a cruelty in betrayal that cuts deepest when it comes from those you love most. If it had been another woman, a stranger, perhaps I could have borne it. But my daughter? My own flesh and blood? The thought sickened me, and yet I could not escape it. Sometimes I would catch myself staring at her while she laughed, and for a fleeting second, I wanted to reach out to tell her everything, to beg her not to destroy me. But the words never came. Instead, I carried them inside, heavy as stones, waiting for the day when silence would no longer hold them. The mind can lie to itself once. It can whisper excuses, invent stories, weave illusions thick enough to cover pain. But when the truth comes a second time, heavier, undeniable, the mind has nowhere left to hide. I returned to his house a week later. My body moved as if in habit, but my heart carried a different weight. I told myself I wasn't searching for anything. I told myself I was going simply to sit in my chair, to feel the sunlight, to remember peace. But inside me, a quiet dread throbbed, warning me I might find more than I wanted. The moment I stepped into that room, I felt it, that shift, that difference. My scarf was still there, folded on the chair as though waiting for me. My cup was where I had left it, but on the floor near the window something caught my eye. A hairpin, silver, thin, delicate. Not mine, not something I would ever wear. I bent slowly, my knees stiff, my hand trembling as I picked it up. Even before I held it, I knew. I had seen that pin before, glinting in my daughter's hair as she dressed for outings. I had watched her twist it in with casual grace. It was hers. The weight of it in my hand made my heart sink lower than it had ever sunk. The lipstick could have been explained away, if I tried hard enough. But this was a second confirmation. This was no accident, no coincidence. I closed my fist around the pin, pressing it into my palm until it left a mark. The room no longer felt like mine. It felt like a crime scene, one where my love and my motherhood collided in a way too cruel to name. I sank into the chair, staring at the pin in my hand. How many times had she sat where I sat now? How many times had she laughed in this room, believing it was hers too? Did she know it was mine first? Did he tell her? Or did they both leave me to discover it in silence, to carry the shame like a cloak I never asked for? The hairpin mocked me. It glittered innocently in the light, just as the lipstick had. Small, ordinary things. Yet each one carried the weight of betrayal. Each one chipped away at the illusion I had clung to. I placed it on the table beside the lipstick, and for a moment I stared at them both, side by side, her objects in my sanctuary. A cruel collection of evidence I never asked to gather. That day, I stopped lying to myself. Denial was no longer possible. My daughter was there. Twice I had found her trace. Twice the room had betrayed me. And now, the truth pressed heavy against my chest. I was sharing a man with my own child. At home, her presence became unbearable. She wore her lipstick casually, as though it were only paint, as though it carried no weight. She leaned into the mirror, adjusting her hair, pressing her lips together in that shade of red, unaware that every motion sliced through me. One evening, she sat across from me at the dinner table, her lips glowing with that color. She smiled as she spoke of trivial things, a friend she had met, a dress she admired, a song she couldn't stop humming. She laughed, carefree, her eyes bright. And I, her mother, sat in silence, staring at the red on her mouth, and saw not joy but betrayal. I wanted to scream, to slam my hand on the table, to demand. Do you know where I saw that red? Do you know what room holds your secrets? But my tongue was heavy, my throat tight. The words burned inside me, but refused to leave. Her smile was the cruelest part. So innocent, so unknowing. She believed her secret was safe. She believed her glow unnoticed. And perhaps that was what hurt most, not just that she had been where I had been, but that she carried it with such ease, while I carried only pain. Every time she reapplied the lipstick, twisting the tube open with practiced fingers, I remembered finding it in that room. Every time she brushed back her hair with delicate care, I remembered the pin glittering on the floor. And each time she smiled, I felt myself breaking further, because her happiness had been carved out of the very space where mine once lived. Sleep deserted me. At night, I lay awake, staring into darkness, my mind painting images I wished I could erase. I saw him with her. I saw his eyes, the ones that once made me feel alive, resting on her with the same weight. I saw his hands, the ones that had brushed mine with gentleness, brushing hers. I saw her lips, painted red, pressed where mine once had been. The images would not leave me. They grew sharper with each night, gnawing at me, until I felt hollowed out by jealousy, sorrow, rage. I turned in my bed, twisting the sheets, whispering to myself, begging for silence in my head. But the silence outside only made the noise inside louder. I wondered if he compared us, if he looked at her and saw youth, brightness, the glow of newness. If he looked at me and saw only years, lines, weariness. I wondered if he ever thought of how cruel it was, binding mother and daughter to the same secret, making us rivals without our knowledge. Sometimes I rose in the night and wandered the house, listening to her breathing through the thin walls, steady and untroubled. I stood by her door and imagined her dreams sweet, light, untouched by the heaviness I carried. And I hated her for that peace, my own daughter, and I hated her for sleeping soundly while I lay in torment. I whispered questions into the darkness. Why her? Why me? The night gave me no answers, only the echo of my own pain. And so, though I never spoke the words aloud, inside me the silence broke. I admitted to myself what I could not admit to anyone else, that my daughter and I were entangled with the same man, that my gift of lipstick had become the key to betrayal, that my sanctuary had been invaded not by a stranger, but by my own flesh and blood. It was the kind of truth that leaves no one whole. And though I wore silence in the day, inside I screamed every moment of every night. If the lipstick was the spark and the hairpin the flame, then her new habits became the fire that consumed me. At first, it was small things. She would leave the house in the evenings, saying she was meeting a friend, or studying, or running errands. Ordinary excuses. But what made them unbearable was the way they sounded. Too polished. Too ready. as if each word had been rehearsed before her lips even parted. I watched her closely. I memorized the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the rhythm of her sentences. And what I saw was not innocent. It was a performance, the kind of smoothness that only comes from practice. She began returning home late, the glow of excitement still clinging to her. Sometimes her hair was slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed, her eyes carrying a light she did not explain. She would walk past me quickly, offering a few words that sounded more like lines in a play than truths spoken from the heart. Each time she slipped out, I counted the hours until her return. I sat awake in the dark, the clock ticking louder than her footsteps, my imagination filling the silence with visions I could not bear. I pictured her in that room, my room, sitting in my chair, laughing where I had once laughed, taking from me the one sanctuary I thought was mine. The pattern became undeniable. Her absences multiplied, her excuses thinner. And with each lie spoken so smoothly, I felt her slipping further from me, not as a daughter, but as a woman I no longer knew. Betrayal is not only carried in the heart, it seeps into the body, poisoning every part of you. I began to feel it physically. When she left the house, my stomach twisted. I sat in silence, feeling nausea rise as I pictured her footsteps tracing the same path as mine, entering the same door, breathing the same air. My throat tightened, food lost its taste, and even water felt heavy in my mouth. At night, the torment grew worse. I would wake suddenly, drenched in sweat, the image of her red lips against him haunting my dreams. My chest would pound so fiercely I thought my heart might break through my ribs. I pressed my hand against it, trying to calm it, whispering prayers into the darkness. But prayers could not erase the visions. My hands shook when I touched the things in my home. The plates, the clothes, the broom, everything reminded me of her, of me, of the gulf widening between us. Sometimes, I caught myself pressing my nails into my palms until they left deep red marks, as though pain in my flesh could distract me from the torment in my mind. Even my reflection betrayed me. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw myself. I saw lines, shadows, tired eyes. And behind them, I saw her, younger, brighter, painted red, carrying the glow of someone wanted. I turned away quickly, sickened by the comparison. My body carried the truth before my mouth could speak it. Betrayal was not only in my heart. It was in my blood, my bones, my stomach that twisted tighter with every lie she told. It might have been easier if the torment had stayed locked within me. But the world has a way of feeding pain, of sharpening what is already cutting deep. One morning in the market, I heard two women speaking in low voices. They did not know I was behind them, their words falling like stones into my ears. Have you seen her daughter lately? Always dressed up, lips shining like a film star. She must have someone keeping her busy. The other laughed, sharp and cruel. Not someone her age, I think. Someone older. Look at the way she carries herself. That is not the glow of a schoolgirl romance. That is the look of someone who has stepped into a grown woman's world. Their laughter rang in my head long after I walked away. My hands trembled so much I nearly dropped the basket I carried. Their words confirmed what I had already known but had tried desperately to bury. It was not only me who saw it. Others saw it too. I could not bear the thought of being pitted, of being mocked as the mother whose daughter shared her shadow. I carried that shame like a cloak, heavy and suffocating, every word from the neighbors pressing it tighter around me. It was no longer only my secret torment. It was becoming a story the world was beginning to tell, one that placed me at the center of humiliation. There comes a point when silence is no longer survival, but surrender. And I could not surrender. I watched her walk into the house one evening, her smile bright, her lips painted in that red that haunted me. She spoke casually, asking about dinner, humming as though the world was kind and light. She did not know that inside me something had shifted. The lipstick, the hairpin, the lies, the whispers, they had all built a fire that now burned too hot to ignore. I could no longer excuse, no longer deny, no longer carry the shame alone. She had taken what was mine, entered my sanctuary, smiled in my face while mocking me in secret. I knew then that I would act. that I would not let her glow blind me while my own light was snuffed out. She thought her secret was safe. She thought her mother blind. But I had seen. I had gathered. I had endured. And now endurance is finished. I will not tell you then what I planned, only that the decision was made. If she wanted to play with fire, then she would feel the burn. That night, as I lay awake, I did not toss and turn as before. My mind was quiet, clear, steady. For the first time in weeks, I slept without dreams, because I knew the next part of this story would not be silence. It would be action. The decision, once made, did not leave me. It sat heavy in my chest, steady as my own heartbeat. Days passed, but the fire in me did not cool. If anything, it grew hotter, fed by every smile she gave me, every laugh she carried, every absence that stretched longer into the night. I began to plan in silence, quiet, careful, methodical. I told myself I was not only her mother, but also her judge. And if she had chosen to play with my fire, then I would be the one to show her the burn. The idea came to me not in a rush, but in pieces. Each time she twisted that lipstick open, I thought of how much she loved it, how it had become her signature. She could live without many things, but not that shade. And so I decided if she could not leave it behind, then it would be the vessel of her punishment. One afternoon, when the streets were busy and no one watched too closely, I walked to the small market on the edge of town. My steps were steady, but inside me there was a storm. I kept my head low, my scarf pulled close, my eyes fixed on the ground. The stalls buzzed with noise, sellers calling out, children laughing, pots clattering. But for me the world felt muted, like I was moving underwater. I stopped at a stall tucked in the corner, away from the main road. The man behind it was older, his hands stained from years of mixing and crafting. Paints, varnishes, solvents, bottles lined his shelves like soldiers. My fingers trembled as I pointed to what I needed. Permanent paint, thick, strong, the kind that clings and does not wash away. He asked me what it was for. My mouth was dry, but I managed to say repairs, something that must not fade. He nodded without suspicion, wrapped it carefully, and placed it into my hands. I held that package close to my chest as I walked home, as though it were a child, as though it were something sacred. In truth, it was poison. Not poison of the body, but of pride, of beauty, of the face she wore so carelessly while trampling on me. That night, when the house was quiet and the world outside had gone still, I unwrapped it. I placed the paint on the table beside her lipstick, the two objects staring at me like adversaries. One carried her power, her glow. The other, my retribution. I looked at them both and whispered to myself, soon, you will know what it means to hurt me. But even in my anger, doubt clawed at me. I am her mother. I carried her. I raised her. I fed her from my own hunger, clothed her from my own lack, gave her every coin I could spare. Could I truly do this? Could I truly take from her the very thing she loved most? I sat in my chair, the paint in one hand, her lipstick in the other. My hand shook, my heart racing. Images flooded my mind. Her as a little girl, running barefoot in the yard, laughing with her hair tangled by the wind. Her small hands tugging at my dress. Her eyes looking at me with trust, so pure it almost hurt. How could the same child grow into the woman who had taken what was mine? Tears blurred my vision. I pressed my palms against my face, whispering prayers I did not finish. Was I a monster for even thinking of this? Was I damning myself forever? But then, as quickly as the softness came, it vanished. The tears dried on my cheeks, replaced by heat. Because with every memory of her innocence came the sharper memory of her betrayal. The lipstick on his table, the hairpin glinting by the window, the rehearsed excuses, the glow on her face that mirrored the glow I had once carried from him. She had not thought of me when she entered that room. She had not thought of me when she laughed in my chair. She had not thought of me when she painted her lips with the color I had given her. Why should I think of her now? My doubt was crushed by anger, by sorrow, by a sense of justice that grew stronger than fear. My body trembled not from hesitation anymore, but from resolve. I whispered into the darkness, my voice steady now. She took from me what she should never have touched. Now I will take from her what she holds most dear. And with that, the last thread of doubt snapped. What remained was a decision, sharp and final. The paint was ready. The lipstick was waiting. And I, her mother, had become her reckoning. I sat at the table, the two objects before me. Her lipstick, my paint. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Every sound felt dangerous, every breath too loud. I unscrewed the lipstick slowly, the twist of the tube steady, deliberate. The red rose up, smooth, glowing, mocking me with its brightness. My hands trembled, but my eyes did not leave it. This was the weapon she had carried, the mark of her glow, the tool of her betrayal. Beside it, the paint waited, thick, permanent, unforgiving. I opened the small jar. The smell hit me first, sharp, chemical, clinging. My throat tightened, my stomach turned. I dipped a thin brush into it, steadying my hand though every nerve screamed. Stroke by stroke, I layered the paint onto the tip of the lipstick. Slow, careful, precise, each movement deliberate, as though I were writing a scripture of vengeance. The red disappeared beneath the glossy, toxic sheen. The brush scraped softly. The jar clinked when I set it down. My heartbeat thundered louder than both. When it was done, I twisted the tube back down, sealing the paint inside. It looked innocent again, harmless, ordinary, just another piece of beauty waiting to be used. I held it in my hand for a long moment, heavy, cold. Then I placed it carefully back in her bag, where she always kept it, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The hours that followed stretched like years. I could not sit. I could not stand it. I moved through the house like a ghost, my hands restless, my body trembling. Every tick of the clock scraped against my nerves. I listened for her footsteps, her laughter, her humming. I knew it was coming the moment she would reach for that tube, twist it open, press it to her lips. I asked myself again and again, what have I done? But then I remembered the lipstick in his room, the hairpin on the floor, her glow at the dinner table while I sank into the shadows, the whispers of the neighbors, the lies rehearsed so smoothly. I told myself, I have only given her what she gave me. The weight of waiting grew unbearable. I felt the sweat on my back, the dryness in my throat. My hands shook each time I touched them together. I thought of running into her room and taking it back, undoing everything. But my feet would not move. My anger held me still. I waited, and in that waiting, I became something else. No longer only a mother, no longer only a woman betrayed, but something colder, something sharper, a hand of punishment. She appeared just as the night deepened, humming softly, her steps light. She was preparing for another outing, another night of laughter and secrets. I watched her from the doorway unseen. She laid her dress across the bed, smoothed it with careful hands, and turned to the mirror. Her hair fell in waves, her eyes glowed. She smiled at her reflection, the smile of someone confident, untouchable. And then her hand reached for it, the lipstick. She picked it up with the same casual grace she always had, as though it belonged to her more than it ever had to me. She twisted it open, the tube rising, revealing the paint hidden inside. She did not know. She could not know. She hummed louder, a tune sweet and careless. She leaned closer to the mirror, lips parted slightly, her eyes alight with anticipation. She was radiant. She was triumphant. She was about to write her betrayal across her own mouth. And I, her mother, stood in the shadows, watching. She pressed it to her lips. The sound of it soft, smooth, the faint drag of the stick against skin, seared into me. One stroke, upper lip. Another stroke, lower lip. She pressed them together, smiling at her reflection, admiring the glow. She saw beauty. I saw vengeance. The paint shone bright, glossy, permanent. She tilted her head, pleased with herself, humming louder, oblivious to the truth. My chest tightened. My breath caught. For a moment, I felt everything at once. Rage, sorrow, triumph, guilt. She laughed softly, tossing her hair, leaning back to admire the final touch. She thought she was preparing for another night of power, of secrets. She did not know she had just sealed my revenge onto her own face. And I narrate it now with calm, not because it did not break me, but because it was the only calm I had left. She wore my punishment without knowing. She painted it across her lips as easily as she had painted her lies. At that moment, the silence in the room was louder than any scream, because the stroke of color was not only hers. It was mine. The scream tore through the house like glass shattering in the dark. My daughter clawed at her mouth, her reflection in the mirror turning from delight to horror in seconds. The glossy red sheen she had admired was no longer beauty, it was agony. She stumbled back, knocking over a chair, her hand pressed desperately against her lips. Her breath came in ragged bursts. She shrieked, "It burns! It burns!" Her voice cracked the air and brought chaos to life. The smell of chemicals lingered, faint but sharp, mixing with her cries. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart racing in time with the rising pitch of her voice. For one fleeting second, I thought she might faint right there, her body folding under the fire, crawling across her skin. But no, she kept clawing, kept screaming, and the sound drilled into the walls of the house. The door slammed open and family members poured in, their voices clashing with the shrieks. What happened? Is she bleeding? What did she put on? The questions battered each other, but no answer came fast enough. Someone ran for water, another for oil. A cousin pressed a wet cloth against her lips, but the red only spread further, staining her chin, dripping into the sink. Her screams turned to sobs. "It won't come off. It won't." Tears streaked through the streaks of paint as she rubbed harder. The skin at the corners cracked, and blood seeped into the scarlet, making the scene grotesque. Panic rose with every passing second. Footsteps hammered up and down the hallway. The youngest children cried from the doorway, terrified by her screams. Someone fumbled with their phone, shouting into it for an ambulance. Others argued, "Drive her yourself." "No, wait for the paramedics." The air grew thick with confusion, and in the middle of it all, she writhed on the floor, holding her face, begging anyone who could hear her to stop the fire. When the wail of a siren cut through the chaos, it was like the sound of salvation and dread rolled into one. Red lights flashed against the windows as paramedics rushed in, voices steady, movements practiced. "Step back. Give her air. Don't touch her face." They lifted her gently, strapping her to the stretcher as she cried and gasped, still clutching at her burning lips. Her eyes darted wildly, searching the room, locking on me for a moment. "Mama, help me," she screamed, her voice raw and trembling. I reached for her hand, my grip firm, my face unreadable. Inside me, something twisted, love, guilt, and cold resolve knotted into one unbreakable rope. The stretcher rolled out the door, bumping down the steps as the family trailed after in a frenzy. Neighbors gathered at gates, whispers spreading like sparks. The paramedics loaded her into the back of the ambulance, doors slamming shut behind. The siren rose again, louder, sharper, slicing the night apart. I climbed in beside her, her hand still locked in mine. The engine roared, the world outside blurred into streaks of light, and the house that once held our secrets disappeared behind us. The ambulance screeched into the hospital bay, and before the doors even swung open, nurses were waiting with a gurney. My daughter's cries had grown weaker, hoarse from the endless screaming, but every breath still carried agony. "It's still burning. Please, somebody, make it stop," she wailed as they lifted her out. The cold air of the night hit her skin, and the fluorescent light of the emergency ward swallowed her up, as if the hospital itself was bracing for the chaos she carried. The doctors moved quickly, their voices clipped, professional, but laced with the edge of disbelief. "What exactly happened?" one asked as he leaned closer, adjusting his glasses to examine her swollen lips. Her face was flushed, her cheeks streaked with tears, and the once glossy lipstick had fused into a hardened, unnatural mask across her mouth. "It looks like a chemical burn," another muttered, peering closer but not daring to touch just yet. He flicked on a pen light, examining the edges where red had cracked into angry fissures, skin splitting and oozing beneath. "What substance was this? Paint? Resin? This is not cosmetic material." My daughter tried to speak, but the movement tore at her lips and drew another sharp cry. It was just lipstick, she moaned, her voice raw. Just lipstick. The words broke against her sobs, disbelief dripping from her tone. The doctors exchanged quick glances, their eyes carrying silent questions they dared not speak aloud. Lipstick did not do this. No shade, no brand, no beauty product could scorch and scar the way her lips now looked. This was something harsher, something alien to their usual cases. The nurse swabbed gently at the edges, trying to see if any of the substance would yield. It didn't. It clung stubbornly, as though mocking every attempt at removal. The room smelled faintly of chemicals, a sharp tang that made one doctor recoil. "This isn't cosmetic at all," he confirmed grimly, shaking his head. My daughter clutched at the sheets, her body writhing under the sterile lights. "Please don't let me lose my face," she whispered through trembling sobs. "Please." The lead doctor straightened, his brow furrowed. "We'll need to prepare her for immediate intervention," he announced, already issuing orders to the team. "Sterile irrigation, toxicology consult, possible surgical excision if adhesion doesn't release. We don't have time to waste." Their voices overlapped, nurses moving, carts rolling, gloves snapping into place. Shock lingered in the air, but it was already being tempered by the necessity of action. Still, beneath the rush of protocol, the disbelief remained. Something about this wasn't natural. Something about this was deeply wrong. I stood just beyond the foot of the bed, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles whitened. To everyone in the room, I was the picture of a mother gripped by panic. Eyes wide, lips pressed tight, shoulders trembling as though I might collapse at any second. I leaned forward when they examined her, gasped softly when they spoke of surgery, and reached for her hand when her cries grew unbearable. Inside me, though, a very different storm was raging. Behind the veil of concern, I hid the truth. I had done this. With my own hands, I switched the tube. I had set this night into motion. And now, as her body trembled under the harsh lights, as the doctors worked feverishly to undo what had been done, I wore my mask as carefully as any actor. "Stay with her," a nurse told me, guiding me closer. I brushed my daughter's hair back from her sweat-soaked face, whispering, "It's going to be all right." My tone carried all the softness of a mother's comfort, but underneath, my heart pounded with the heaviness of a secret I could never let slip. Every time the doctor asked, "Are you sure it was lipstick? Was it opened? Did anyone tamper with it?" My chest tightened, but my face betrayed nothing. I shook my head, feigning the same confusion that filled the rest of the room. "It was a gift," I murmured, voice breaking just enough to seem real. I don't understand how this could happen. The truth clawed at me, but I forced it deeper, burying it beneath layers of practiced sorrow. I squeezed her hand harder, letting her believe I was her anchor, while in reality I was the architect of her suffering. When her eyes found mine, glassy with pain, searching for reassurance, I bent lower and whispered words I knew she needed. "I'm here. I won't leave you." The mask held firm. No one could see the truth beneath it. The decision came quickly. The lead doctor's voice cut through the flurry of motion. "We can't wait any longer. Prep for surgery." Nurses wheeled trays into place, the rattle of metal instruments filling the room. The fluorescent lights glared down like unblinking eyes, catching every shimmer of sweat on her face, every crimson streak of agony staining her lips. My daughter's breathing quickened. She tried to speak, but the pain twisted her words into jagged fragments. "Please don't let me." Her sob trailed into silence as the anesthetic mask lowered. The hiss of oxygen filled the room. Her fingers twitched once in mine before growing heavy. The doctors leaned in with practiced efficiency, murmuring instructions. "Careful with the borders. Minimal abrasion. Keep saline ready." The red on her mouth glistened under the surgical light. Unyielding, unnatural, a false beauty now weaponized against her. The first irrigation attempt failed. The resin-like coat clung tighter, resisting every drop of sterile solution. "It's bonding deeper," the surgeon muttered, his brow furrowed. A scalpel gleamed, lifted, then set back down. Too much force would tear living flesh away with the hardened paint. Every instrument carried risk. They tried solvents, adjusted the angle, shifted strategies, but every second passed like an eternity. Beneath the sterile masks, The doctor's eyes flickered with unease. They were trained for burns, for injuries, for accidents, but not for this. Not for paint fused with skin. The suction whirred softly. Gauze darkened, discarded. A clock ticked somewhere, each second hammering into my ears. I stood motionless, my heart thundering louder than the machine's. This was the consequence of a decision I had taken in cold blood, and now strangers' hands worked frantically to undo what could not be undone. One nurse whispered, "The tissue is coming off," and the surgeon's head snapped toward her. "Hold steady. Less pressure." His tone was calm, but I saw the truth in his eyes. They were fighting a battle they were not sure they could win. I said nothing. They asked me to step out. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud, leaving me stranded in a hallway that felt too bright, too clean, too empty. I sank into a hard plastic chair, the kind that offered no comfort, and folded my hands tightly in my lap. Every sound in that corridor seemed louder than it should have been. The wheels of a cart squealing against the floor. A nurse's hurried footsteps echoing. A distant voice calling for blood work. Each noise seemed like it carried a piece of my daughter's fate. I stared at the sterile white tiles beneath my shoes, but in my mind I saw the room. The man's room, the one that had once been my sanctuary. I remembered the golden light that poured through the curtains in the afternoon, the quiet hum of his voice, the illusion of belonging. I remember the day I found her lipstick there, glowing like a warning I hadn't wanted but could not ignore. And now here I sat, in a hospital corridor, waiting for strangers to stitch together what I had torn apart. My body trembled, but not from grief alone. It was guilt, anger, betrayal, and a strange hollow sense of justice colliding within me, none of them able to silence the others. I thought of her as a child, her laughter filling our small home. I thought of the pride in her eyes when I first gave her that lipstick, the way she had admired herself in the mirror. Those memories pressed against the darker ones, the secret glances she gave the man I thought was mine, the late nights, the lipstick on the table in the wrong house. The chair beneath me felt like punishment. The silence pressed against my chest. I wanted to scream, to weep, to confess. But I remained still, my mask held firmly in place even as it suffocated me. The doors opened at last. The surgeon emerged, his gloves peeled off, his face a mixture of exhaustion and gravity. He approached slowly, as though carrying words that weighed too much to be spoken quickly. "We did what we could," he said. His voice was steady but not hopeful. The substance wasn't cosmetic. It adhered to her tissue. "We removed as much as possible," but he paused, his gaze heavy on me. "There will be lasting damage. Scarring. Functionality may return over time, but it will not be the same." The words fell one by one, striking me harder than I had expected. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to nod. "Will she survive?" I asked, my voice low, rehearsed in sorrow. "Yes," he replied. "She's stable, but her recovery will be long and painful." This was no ordinary accident. His words lingered, deliberate. I felt their weight press against the secret I carried, but my mask did not slip. I pressed my hand to my chest, exhaling slowly, letting the room believe I was only a mother bracing against grief. They wheeled her past, bandages wrapped around her mouth, monitors beeping softly. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, glassy and heavy, finding mine. In that gaze was a question, unspoken but burning, and it sliced me deeper than any scalpel could. I leaned close, whispering as they pushed her away, "Rest now. I'm here." But when the hallway grew quiet again, when the surgeon's footsteps faded, the truth inside me screamed. I had thought this act would heal the betrayal, that punishing her would erase the shame of sharing a man with my own daughter. But in that moment, I knew what was broken could never be fixed. Not her lips, not her family, not my soul. They brought her home with gauze wrapped tight and instructions folded small. The hallway filled before sunset. Shoes at the door. Coats on chairs. Voices lowered but sharp. Someone set soup on the stove and forgot to light the fire. Someone else collected the used cups, then put them back down in the wrong room. The house carried a new gravity. It bent spines and shortened breaths. Whispers threaded through the rooms. "Lipstick can't do that. It must have been tampered with." Who would? Don't say it here. An aunt took my hand and squeezed until my fingers ached, eyes wet, searching my face for permission to believe a softer story. A cousin stared at the bandage, then at the floor, as if guilt could hide under a rug. The youngest children hovered at door frames, wide-eyed and silent, learning too early that grown-ups carry storms behind their teeth. Her father's people asked for brand names and batch numbers and receipts no one kept. My side counted dates and times and routes she liked to take. Every answer produced another question. Suspicion spread like ink in water. It touched every name. It climbed the walls. She lay on the sofa, painkillers tamping down the sharpest edges, breath shallow, eyes drifting. When she woke, the room leaned toward her. When she slept, it still did. Someone adjusted her blanket every 10 minutes. Someone refreshed the ice. Someone refused to leave, as if absence could be blamed next. Blame moved anyway. It didn't choose a single direction. It split, multiplied, hid in corners, returned with new faces. Why was she always out late? Why was no one watching? Why didn't the store label the danger? Why did she wear so much of it? Why did none of us see this coming? The neighbors sent messages, some prayers, some judgments wrapped in politeness. Two women stood at the fence and spoke into the wind. They didn't look at the windows, but their words walked in on their own. I poured tea I couldn't drink. I held plates I didn't set down. I nodded at people I didn't hear. The house remembered the day we danced in it. It reminded me of the day we wept. It added this day to the shelf of days that changed the size of a family. By night, the whispers dulled to a low hum, but no one truly slept. Doors clicked. Floorboards answered. Every sound asked the same question and refused the same answer. When the last cousin left the hallway and the kettle finally cooled, I stood alone in the kitchen. The clock hands lifted their shoulders and kept walking. The window held the moon in one corner like a coin you meant to spend, and didn't. I set both hands flat on the table. The wood was scarred from years that had asked too much of it. I felt each groove as if it were a line in my palm. In that quiet, I faced what I had done without flinching. I had chosen. I had acted. Not from a prankster's thrill. Not from a stranger's cruelty. From a wound that would not clot. From a truth that had no mouth until I gave it one. I thought of the room that had once made me feel young again. I thought of the chair by the window. I thought of the lipstick left where only my scarf should have been. I measured the weight of that sight against the weight of my act and found they were not equal, but they were related. Pain rarely carries a scale that satisfies everyone. It only carries consequences. People will say a mother should never. People will say a daughter should never. People will say a man should never. They will be right and wrong at the same time. Life is not a courtroom that ends at noon with a clear verdict. Life is a long corridor where every door you open changes the shape of your shadow. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel finished. I felt steady. A steadiness made of iron filings and old prayers, and the stubborn dignity of a woman who was told there was nothing in this world that belonged to her alone, and believed it until she found a room that proved otherwise. I would carry what I'd done. My sorrow belonged to me, and so did my decision. Some will hate me for it. Some will understand quietly and never admit it. I can live with both. I sat at the edge of her bed when the medicines softened the hard corners of her pain. The night lamp threw a small circle of light on the wall. The rest of the room stayed honest. She opened her eyes and found me. We didn't speak for a long time because words can bruise more than hands when they arrive at the wrong speed. I waited for her gaze to settle. Then I told the truth that could be said without names. You walked through a door that was not meant for you to walk through, I said. You wore a color that wasn't just a color. Her eyes filled but didn't spill. I kept going. You took from me the one place I laid down my burden and remembered I was more than a pair of steady hands. You stepped into that memory and made it smaller. You left proof on the table and thought the house would keep your secret. Houses talk. So do objects. Lipstick has a louder voice than people think. She turned her face a little, careful of the bandage. Her breath snagged. She tried to form a word and stopped. I spared her the effort. I am not innocent, I said. I chose something I can't return. You are not innocent. You chose something you never should have touched. Between us stands a man who fed us both the same story and watched it burn. And even if he never speaks again, the flames know his name. Her fingers searched for mine on the blanket. I let them find me. I held her hand, not to be forgiven, not to forgive, but because the earth is heavy and two hands hold better than one. When you heal, I said, you will want to hate me. You might succeed. Hate is a strong engine. But before you let it drive you, remember the first day you wore that red and how powerful you felt. Ask yourself what power is for. Ask yourself where it should never go. Her eyes closed. A tear slipped anyway. It soaked the edge of the gauze. I brushed her hair back with the gentlest touch I had left. This house will be quiet for a time, I said. We will live inside that quiet. We will count our breaths until they steady. We will speak less and mean more. And if you wish to leave when you can, I will not lock the door. But the door you opened in me will never close the same way again. I stood. The lamp hummed. The window held its coin of light. Before I left, I placed a small mirror face down on her bedside table. Not to shame her, to rest it. Some reflections need darkness before they can be trusted again. I will tell you the rest without decoration. The doctors will write their notes. The bandages will change. The scars will decide the shape of her smile. The family will pick a version of events they can sleep beside. The neighbors will harvest gossip until the field is bare and then move on to the next crop. The man will learn what absence tastes like when it's his turn to sit in a quiet room and hear nothing back. As for me, I will return to that room one last time. I will touch the chair. I will lift my scarf. I will open the window and let the light come in as if it were washing a stone from the river. I will carry nothing out with me. I will lock that door in my chest and throw the key where light cannot follow. Not from shame, from survival. People want tidy endings. They want either ruin or redemption and nothing in between. Life gives us the middle. It gives us the stubborn middle where love and harm share a hallway, and you must choose which door to keep open so the house does not fill with smoke. I chose it. I will live beside that choice until the roof gives way and the stars take their place above me. This is my story. Maybe it is yours too. If not today, then in a year you haven't reached yet. If not with lipstick, then with another small object that learns how to speak when people lie. Whatever you carry, name it before it names you. Whatever you lose, bury it in ground that grows something back. Whatever you love, protect it with teeth if you must, but count the cost, because every bite leaves a mark you will have to wear where others can see. I have told you what happened in this house. I have given you the edges and the center. I will not ask for your approval. I will not ask for your forgiveness. I will ask for your answer. What would you do? And when your answer comes for you in the middle of the night and sits on the edge of your bed, will you recognize it as yours? This is my story. Maybe it is yours too.